He thought the hardest part was surviving. He was wrong. The hardest part was waking up every morning to a face that wasn't his. The suppressant patch on Junkie Lim's ribs had 47 minutes left. He knew without checking, he always knew, because his body had started its quiet, humiliating betrayal right on schedule. That faint warmth crawling up his throat. Cedar and rain-wet stone bleeding through his skin like a confession he never agreed to make. He pressed his palm flat against his sternum the way you press a wound, willing it back, willing himself ordinary for 4 to 7 more minutes. Down the hall, Seo stirred. He always stirred in those 4 to 7 minutes. 3 years old and already his father's son in the one way Junkie could never suppress, never patch over, never medicate into silence. The boy could smell what Junkie was. Toddled into the room with his hair wrecked and his small face creased from sleep and pressed his nose directly into Junkie's neck without a word, without needing one. Junkie held him. Stared at the water-stained ceiling of a one-room apartment in Incheon that no one was supposed to know about. Seo had Kim Ji-ho's jaw. Kim Ji-ho's eyes, that cold, precise stillness that belonged on a man who'd built an empire on other people's fear, not on a child who still needed help with his shoelaces. 3 years of running, 3 years of black market blockers and false names and jobs that paid in cash and asked nothing, and every single morning the evidence sat in Junkie's arms and looked at him. You can hide everything, the boy's face said, without saying anything at all. Except me. Junkie kissed the top of his son's head. Pulled the morning's fresh patch from the drawer. Pressed it down hard. 4 to 7 minutes. He had 4 to 7 minutes before the world could smell what he was. Today, that wouldn't be enough. His name was Lim Junho. That was what the ID card in the kitchen drawer said. That was what the landlord called him when rent was due, what the pharmacy 2 blocks over had on file, what the day labor dispatch office printed on his weekly slip. Lim Junho. A perfectly unremarkable name belonging to a perfectly unremarkable man. Junkie Lim had not existed for 3 years. He moved through Incheon's Namdong district the way water moves through cracks, not forcing anything, not drawing attention, simply finding the path of least resistance and following it until it ran out. He knew which convenience store clerks worked the morning shift and never looked up from their phones. He knew which pharmacist asked too many questions, the one on Seonggan Row, and which one simply scanned his suppressants without comment and told him to have a good day. He knew the alley shortcut that saved 4 minutes off the walk to the dispatch office, and he took it every time, because 4 minutes was 4 minutes, and in his life those 4 minutes were the difference between Seo being awake when he got home and Seo having learned a new word from the second-hand tablet Junkie had bought him, a new word that would be waiting at the door like a small, unavoidable grenade. Today's grenade came before he even left. He was pulling on his jacket when Seo appeared in the bedroom doorway, dragging his stuffed rabbit by one ear, still wearing yesterday's socks because Junkie hadn't won that particular battle yet and had quietly decided he never would. The boy studied him with those impossible eyes, that calm, assessing weight that had no business living in a 3-year-old's face, and then pointed at Junkie's jacket pocket. "Appa," Seo said. "Appa go?" Junkie's hand stopped on the zipper. It was the 3rd time this week. The word had arrived quietly, without warning, the way the worst things always did. Seo had heard it somewhere, a playground, a television commercial, another child calling across a parking lot, and had filed it away with the ruthless efficiency of a small person assembling the world from borrowed pieces. "Appa. Father." He said it the way he said water and shoe and no, like a fact, like something that simply existed and required naming. Except he said it like a question now. Every single time, just slightly, the end of the word tilted upward. "Appa?" Like he was checking. Like he understood, in whatever wordless way a 3-year-old understood anything, that the answer to this particular question was complicated. Junkie crouched down to his level. Straightened the boy's collar, mostly to have something to do with his hands. "Junkie Sai goes to work," he said, carefully, the same answer he always gave. "Seo stays with Mrs. O. Junkie Sai comes back before dinner." Seo considered this. Touched the collar of Junkie's jacket with 2 fingers, the way he touched things he was deciding whether to trust. Then he held up the rabbit. "Appa go too." Junkie exhaled through his nose. Took the rabbit. Tucked it into his jacket pocket with the ears sticking out, because this was apparently his life. "Rabbit goes too," he said. "Happy?" Seo's mouth curved, Jiho's mouth, Jiho's exact curve, the one that was never quite a smile and somehow worse for it, and he turned and walked back down the hall to wait for Mrs. O with the gravity of a person who had just resolved a matter of international importance. Junkie stood up. Stood there for a moment in the narrow hallway of an apartment that wasn't his name, in a city that didn't know he existed, holding a jacket pocket full of stuffed rabbit and the specific exhaustion of a man who had outrun everything except the one thing that lived in his own home. The dispatch office had him on inventory work today. A warehouse in the industrial port. Cash at the end of the shift, no forms, no questions about the name on his ID. He would be invisible for 8 hours, which was the closest thing to safe he had learned to accept. He would be home before dinner. He would repatch at the usual time. Tomorrow would be the same as today, because he had built this life with both hands specifically, so tomorrow would always be the same as today, and that sameness was the only armor he had. He locked the door behind him. Down the street, in a parked car Junkie had never seen before, a man raised a phone and took a photograph. The Namdong market on a Thursday afternoon was exactly the kind of place Junkie had chosen it to be: loud, crowded, anonymous. Stalls packed tight enough that you moved with the current rather than against it, vendors calling over each other, the smell of fish and fried dough and diesel from the delivery trucks idling at the loading bay. Nobody looked at anyone directly. Nobody had the time. Junkie moved through it with Seo on his hip and a basket in his free hand, doing the mental arithmetic of a man who had learned to shop the way soldiers learn to patrol, efficiently, without lingering, always aware of every exit. Rice. The cheaper ramen, not the kind Seo preferred but the kind that was 401 less per pack. The small container of banana milk that was the one indulgence Junkie allowed without negotiation, because some battles weren't worth the energy. Seo was narrating. He did this now, a running commentary on everything he observed, delivered in the hybrid language he'd assembled from Junkie's careful Korean and the cartoons on the tablet and Mrs. O's Incheon dialect. Fish. Big fish. Junkie sigh, that fish is looking at me. Junkie sigh, I want that. Junkie sigh. No, Junkie said, to all of it. He turned down the dry goods aisle. Reached for the rice. And felt it before he saw it, that specific stillness. The way a room changes when something predatory enters it, a pressure drop that the hindbrain registers before the conscious mind catches up. Junkie's hand stayed on the rice. He didn't freeze. Freezing was visible. He simply completed the motion, placed the bag in the basket, and let his eyes track left with the casual drift of a man checking a grocery list he didn't have. End of the aisle. A man in a dark jacket. Tall, lean, the kind of stillness that wasn't relaxation but its opposite. Coiled, contained, deliberate. An unlit cigarette between 2 fingers. Not shopping. Not waiting for anyone. Just standing with his weight distributed evenly and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way men in Jiho's world stood when they were being paid to observe and hadn't decided yet whether what they were observing required action. Ryu Do-yoon. Jiho's second. The man who had once told Junkie, pleasantly, over coffee in a glass-walled office, that his job was to know things before his boss needed to know them. He was looking at Seo. Not at Junkie. At Seo, at the boy's face, the jaw, the eyes, running the same calculation Junkie had run every morning for 3 years, arriving at the same answer in about 4 seconds. Junkie did not run. Running confirmed it. Running was a confession. Running meant the man's hand went to his phone before Junkie reached the exit, and then it didn't matter how fast he moved because the call would already be made and Jiho's world was large and patient and had more doors than Junkie had legs. He walked. He walked to the end of the aisle, turned right, not left toward the exit, because left was too direct, too obvious, moved through the produce section with Seo still narrating on his hip, paid for the rice and the ramen and the banana milk at the self-checkout without looking up, and walked out through the rear entrance by the loading bay where the delivery truck sat idling. He didn't check if Do-yoon followed. Checking meant looking back. Looking back meant fear, and fear meant confirmation. He walked home. Inside the apartment, he set Seo down, gave him the banana milk, and turned to the bedroom. The bag was under the bed. It was always under the bed, a habit from the first year when he'd moved every 4 months, a ghost rule he'd kept even after he stopped needing it. Cash in the front pocket. 3 changes of clothes for Seo, 2 for himself. The secondary ID, a different false name, a cleaner paper trail, one he'd never used. The photograph he kept folded small enough that it didn't take up space or require acknowledgement, just existed at the bottom like a stone. He pulled the bag out. His hands were steady. He noted this with something close to detachment, the same way he'd noted everything in the last 20 minutes, from a slight distance, brain running cold and clear the way it only did when the situation was genuinely bad. He started with Seo's clothes. Rolled them tight the way he'd learned, efficient, no wasted space. How much time did he have? Do-yoon hadn't followed him out, or if he had, he'd been far enough back that Junkie hadn't felt the pressure of it. But that meant nothing. Do-yoon didn't need to follow. Do-yoon needed 30 seconds and a phone signal, and Incheon had excellent phone signal. Where would they go? Busan was too obvious. Seoul was walking into the mouth of it. He thought about the port, a container contact he'd used once 3 years ago, a man who moved people the way other men moved freight. The knock at the door was not aggressive. It was not the police knock, hard, flat, announcing itself. It was patient. Unhurried. The knock of a man who already knew the person on the other side wasn't going anywhere. Seo looked up from his banana milk. Door, he said helpfully. Junkie's hands were still holding the half-packed bag. 40 minutes. He had needed 40 minutes. He'd had 38. Junkie had spent 3 years building Kim Ji-ho in his memory the way you build a wall. Brick by brick, deliberate, each layer mortared with a specific recollection chosen for its ability to hold. The sound of a gunshot in a parking garage. The way blood looked black under sodium lights. The absolute stillness of a man who had just ended another man's life and felt, as far as Junkie could tell, nothing at all. He had constructed a monster with great care and maintained it faithfully, because the monster was the reason he ran and the running was the reason Seo was alive, and so the monster had to stay monstrous, had to stay large and simple and without nuance. He opened the door. Kim Ji-ho was leaning against the door frame with one shoulder, hands in his jacket pockets, looking for all the world like a man who had stopped by without particular urgency. He was wearing charcoal gray. His hair was shorter than Junkie remembered. There were faint lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago, and he was somehow, this was the part Junkie's carefully constructed monster hadn't prepared him for, quieter than the memory. Smaller in the way that real things are always smaller than their shadows. He wasn't looking at Junkie. He was looking past him. At the small person standing in the middle of the room with a carton of banana milk and an expression of serene curiosity, taking in the stranger at the door with those eyes, those particular, devastating eyes, that had no business existing in this apartment or in this life or anywhere within 1,000 kilometers of Junkie's carefully maintained survival. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Kim Ji-ho said, "How old is he?" Not how old is he. Not the upward tilt of genuine inquiry. Flat. Final. The period audible. The voice of a man who was not asking because he didn't know but asking because he wanted to hear Junkie say it, wanted to watch Junkie's face while he said it, was already doing the arithmetic and simply wanted confirmation of what the math had already told him. Junkie said nothing. Ji-ho's gaze moved from Seo to Junkie with the unhurried patience of a man who had never once in his life needed to rush anything. He looked at Junkie the way you look at a problem you've already solved, not with anger, not with the heat of betrayal, just with that cool, assessing attention that had always been more unsettling than rage because rage at least had edges you could map. Do-yoon said he spotted you at the market, Ji-ho said. Conversational. Like they were picking up an interrupted discussion. He thought he was wrong. He sent me the photograph to confirm. A brief pause. He wasn't wrong. Behind Junkie, Seo said, "Man." Ji-ho looked at him again. Something moved across his face, not softness, nothing as readable as softness, but a kind of recognition that was almost worse. The look of a man seeing something he had not known he was looking for and finding, now that he'd found it, that he had always known its shape. 3, Junkie said. The word came out flat and hard and cost him more than he would ever account for. His 3. Ji-ho nodded once. Like a receipt being stamped. Get his things, he said. No. Junkie. The name, his real name, the one no one had said aloud in 3 years, the one that had been living in the kitchen drawer under a false identity, landed like a hand on his sternum. Ji-ho said it without emphasis, without weaponizing it, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted it. Just Junkie. Just the simple fact of knowing who Junkie actually was when Junkie had worked so hard to be no one. You don't come into my home and give orders, Junkie said. His voice was steady. He was proud of how steady it was. You don't get to do that. I'm not giving orders. Ji-ho straightened from the doorframe. He was taller than the doorway made him look. Junkie had forgotten that too, the way the man occupied space without seeming to try. I'm telling you what happens next. There's a difference. Not from where I'm standing. Something shifted in Jiho's expression. Not irritation. Closer to patience. The specific, infinite patience of a man who understood that the outcome was already determined and was simply waiting for the other person to arrive at the same understanding. He looked past Junkie one more time. At Seo, who was now holding the banana milk with both hands and watching the exchange with the focused attention of someone following a tennis match. He has my jaw, Jiho said quietly. Almost to himself. Then, with the same quiet, the same certainty, and my eyes. He has nothing of yours, Junkie said. You were never here. Jiho turned toward the stairwell. There's a car at the curb. Black. You have 10 minutes. He paused without turning back. Bring the rabbit. He'll want it. The door to Seo's room was closed. Jiho couldn't have seen the rabbit from the doorway. Junkie's blood went cold. He'd been watching them far longer than today. The car was exactly what Junkie had expected. Black, unmarked, the kind of vehicle that existed to be unremarkable and achieved it so thoroughly it was almost conspicuous. A driver whose name he wasn't given. Tinted windows that turned the world outside into a gray, sliding blur. Seo was buckled into a seat that had clearly been installed recently, the plastic still carrying that faint chemical newness, and this detail, the prepared child seat, the forethought of it, the fact that Jiho had arrived not just with a car but with the right car, did something cold and clarifying to the inside of Junkie's chest. He had not been found today. He had been retrieved. Jiho sat on the opposite side of Seo, one arm resting along the window ledge, watching the district slide past the glass. He hadn't spoken since the apartment. Hadn't looked at Junkie since the stairwell. He had simply waited while Junkie packed Seo's bag with hands that refused to shake, had walked slightly behind them down to the curb, had opened the car door with the unhurried courtesy of a man who understood that courtesy and captivity were not mutually exclusive. Now he spoke. April, he said. 4 years ago. You presented for the first time in my building. My scent triggered it. He said this the way you read a document aloud, not for the listener's benefit, but to confirm the record. We were together for 7 months. You left in November. A pause. The child is 3. Seo, oblivious, was pressing the rabbit's ears flat against its head and releasing them, absorbed in the experiment. The math isn't complicated, Jiho continued. You were pregnant when you left. Which means you knew, or suspected, before you went. He turned from the window then, and looked at Junkie directly for the first time since the apartment doorway. You knew. And you left anyway. Yes, Junkie said. The simplicity of the answer seemed to interest Jiho more than a defense would have. He studied Junkie the way he'd studied Seo in the apartment, with that quiet, cataloging attention, looking for the structural truth beneath the surface. I want to understand something, Jiho said. Not the leaving. I understand the leaving. You saw something that frightened you and you made a decision. His voice carried no heat. No accusation in the conventional sense. What I want to understand is the 3 years. The silence. The deliberate, he paused, selected the word carefully, withholding. I protected my son. From what, specifically? From you. Junkie said it without flinching. From your world. From growing up understanding that his father resolves problems with a gun in a parking garage at 2 in the morning. From being leverage. From being a liability. From being this, he gestured at the car, at the tinted windows, at the driver who was performing deafness with professional commitment, whatever this is. Jiho absorbed this without expression. Then, you took my son from me. I took my son away from danger. You took my son, Jiho repeated, with the same flat patience he'd used at the doorway, and you raised him under a false name, in a district where you clearly expected to be invisible, and you made a unilateral decision that I did not deserve to know he existed. He tilted his head slightly. That's not protection. That's theft. The word landed precisely as he'd intended it to. Junkie felt his jaw tighten. A child, he said, very carefully, is not property. No, Jiho agreed. He isn't. A beat of silence, during which Junkie almost believed that was the end of it. Then. But in my world, Jiho said, an unclaimed Omega carrying my son is. The temperature in the car dropped by several degrees. Junkie turned to face him fully. Say that again. Jiho didn't. He didn't need to. The words were already occupying the space between them, solid and immovable, and he clearly understood that repeating them would be performance, and Kim Jiho had never been interested in performance. You're not claimed, he said instead, quieter. You've been running suppressants for 3 years, don't look at me like that, I can still tell, which means you've been biologically unprotected and socially invisible in a city that is not safe for unmated Omegas, and you did all of this while raising a child alone. He looked at Seo for a moment. Back at Junkie. That ends today. You don't get to decide that. I already have. Junkie looked at the door handle. Calculated the speed of the car, the consequences, Seo in his buckled seat. Put the calculation away. Where are you taking us? He said. Not a question. A mirror of Jiho's own method, stating the thing to hear it confirmed. Jiho returned his gaze to the window. The city was changing outside, the low industrial buildings of Namdong giving way to elevated highways, Seoul's skyline assembling itself on the horizon like a statement of intent. Somewhere safe, Jiho said. Safe for who? Jiho didn't answer. In the seat between them, Seo had tired of the rabbit's ears and was now leaning sideways, his head tipping incrementally toward Jiho's arm with the unconscious, animal gravity of a child following warmth. Jiho looked down at him. Didn't move away. The car didn't stop. The building didn't announce itself. That was the first thing Junkie noted. No signage, no corporate logo on the lobby facade, just clean stone and glass and a doorman who nodded at Jiho with the specific deference of someone whose employment depended on never appearing to recognize anyone. The lobby was marble and restrained. 2 men near the elevator bank who were dressed like building staff and stood like soldiers. A security desk with screens that Junkie glimpsed for half a second before the elevator doors opened and swallowed them. Penthouse level. Of course. The elevator required a key card and a code. Jiho entered both without looking at the panel, the way you navigate your own body, automatic, unconscious, total ownership. The doors opened directly into the apartment and Junkie stepped out and stopped. He had prepared himself, on the drive, for something aggressive. Something that announced power the way Jiho's world usually announced it. Loudly, through excess, through the specific vulgarity of men who had come into money through violence and needed the rooms to prove it. He had prepared for gold fixtures and dark wood and the general aesthetic of a man who wanted you to understand immediately that he could have you killed. The penthouse was none of that. It was vast and spare and filled with gray morning light from floor-to-ceiling windows that ran the entire length of the eastern wall. And through those windows Seoul spread itself out in every direction like something that had been arranged specifically for this vantage point. The Han River catching the light to the south, the city grid extending north until it blurred into the mountains, everything small and distant and oddly, obscenely beautiful. The furniture was minimal. Expensive in the way that had nothing to do with display. A low couch. A dining table with clean lines. Shelves with books that had actually been read, spines creased, a few lying flat with things tucked inside them. It looked like somewhere a person actually lived. That was somehow worse than the gold fixtures would have been. Seo had been quiet through the elevator ride with the focused attention he reserved for new environments, processing. Now he took 3 steps into the apartment, looked at the window, and made a sound that Junkie had never heard him make before, a short, sharp intake of breath that preceded, by approximately 1 second, the abandonment of all previously held positions. He ran at the window. Both palms hit the glass at full extension and he pressed his face between them, nose flat against the pane, and laughed. A real laugh, full-bodied, the kind that came from the stomach, soul spread out 60 floors below him, the river, the bridges, the endless grid of a city that had never known he existed, and to Seo it was apparently the funniest, most magnificent thing he had ever encountered in 3 years of life. Big, Seo announced. Very big. From somewhere behind Junkie, almost inaudible, Jiho said, yes. Junkie didn't turn around. He watched his son press both palms to 60 floors of glass and laugh at Seoul and felt the bars close around them both with a sound like a key turning in a very expensive lock. A woman appeared, mid-50s, practical clothes, the manner of someone who ran the household the way Do-yoon ran operations, with quiet efficiency and no wasted motion. She was introduced as Myung-sai. She showed Junkie the room that had been prepared for Seo, and this too had been done in advance, which meant Jiho had known not just where they were but had planned this retrieval with enough lead time to furnish a child's room. Small bed, low shelving, a basket of toys still in packaging. Not extravagant. Calibrated. The room of a man who had thought about what a 3-year-old needed without ever having met his 3-year-old. The room across the hall is yours, Myung Sai said to Junkie. Mr. Kim asks that you make yourself comfortable. Mr. Kim can ask whatever he likes, Junkie said pleasantly. Myung Sai received this without expression and excused herself. Junkie stood in the doorway of Seo's new room and looked at the basket of unpackaged toys and felt something move through him that he refused to name. Not gratitude. Not softening. Something more dangerous than either, the recognition that Jiho had imagined this child, had built a room for a child he'd never met, and had gotten the details almost exactly right. He turned away from it. The security was not theatrical but it was absolute. He had clocked it on the way in, cameras at every angle in the lobby, the elevator override, 2 men on the floor below whose footsteps he could track through the ceiling. The windows didn't open. He checked the frames within 4 minutes of Seo hitting the glass. The stairwell access required the same key card as the elevator. The building had one entrance. One entrance was one exit. Exits were the only thing that mattered. He went back to the window where Seo was still installed, still laughing at Seoul, completely at home in a cage he didn't understand was a cage. Junkie placed his hand flat against the glass next to his son's. Cold. Solid. 60 floors of nothing on the other side. Like it? Seo asked him. Junkie looked out at the city. At the river. At the very particular beauty of a view you couldn't leave. It's something, he said. Seo fell asleep at 8:13, which Junkie knew because he sat on the edge of the small bed and watched his son's breathing slow with the focused attention of a man who had nothing else to do and nowhere to go and was therefore performing the one task available to him with total commitment. The new room didn't seem to trouble Seo. He had examined the toy basket with serious interest, selected a small wooden car with the discernment of someone making a considered investment, and fallen asleep holding it. The unfamiliar ceiling. The unfamiliar sheets. None of it registered as wrong. He was 3 years old and his father was in the room and the car had good wheels. Junkie wished, not for the first time, that he could borrow that. He was still sitting in the dark when the knock came. Not Jiho's knock, lighter, more apologetic. Myung Sai opened the door an inch and said, quietly, that Mr. Kim was in his office when Junkie was ready. And if I'm not ready, Junkie said. A pause. He said you'd say that. He said to tell you the conversation will happen eventually and that tonight is better than tomorrow. Junkie looked at Seo. At the wooden car clutched in one small fist. He got up. The office was at the far end of the penthouse, separated from the living space by a short hallway that felt deliberately transitional, a buffer between the domestic and whatever this room was. The door was open. Jiho was at his desk, jacket off, one lamp burning, a file folder closed in front of him. He looked up when Junkie entered but didn't gesture to the chair across from him or perform any of the theater of hospitality. Just waited. Junkie Saturday. He did it on his own terms, in his own time, and Jiho let him. You wanted to explain yourself, Junkie said. I wanted to show you something. Jiho pushed the folder across the desk. Open it. Junkie looked at it without touching it. What is it? The man you saw me kill. The room rearranged itself slightly around those words. Junkie looked at the folder. Then he reached out and opened it. The file was thorough in the way that only two kinds of organizations managed. Law enforcement and the ones that operated in law enforcement shadow, collecting the same information for entirely different purposes. A photograph on top. A man Junkie didn't recognize, middle-aged, unremarkable face, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without registering. Below the photograph, documents. Records. A ledger of transactions that it took Junkie 30 seconds to understand and another 10 to accept. Boys. 6 of them over 4 years, ranging in age from 7 to 14. Sold. The ledger used codes but the key was attached, and the codes resolved into names and prices and destinations, and Junkie read all of it because he had decided, when he sat down, that he would not look away from anything in this room tonight regardless of what it cost him. He closed the folder. The lamp hummed. Somewhere in the apartment, a distant sound, the building settling, or wind against the high glass. He'd been operating through a procurement network we'd been tracking for 8 months, Jiho said. He wasn't looking at the folder. He was looking at Junkie, watching him process. The night you were there, you weren't supposed to be there. I told you to take Seo's car because yours was being serviced and you came back early from. He stopped. Started again. The location was a controlled resolution. Not a murder. You executed him. Yes. Without a trial. Without any process. The process, Jiho said evenly, had a 6-month waiting period and a 70% chance of acquittal based on his legal team. The boys he sold didn't have 6 months. A pause. Neither did the ones he was brokering when we found him. Junkie was quiet for a long time. He had carried the memory of that night for 3 years like a piece of glass lodged somewhere internal, not debilitating, but always present, shifting when he moved, reminding him of its edges. He had been so certain of what he'd seen. The certainty had been the foundation of everything, of running, of hiding, of the false name and the suppressants and the fierce, exhausting architecture of survival he'd built over Seo like a shelter. The certainty was still there, but its shape had changed. This doesn't make you a good man, Junkie said. I know. It doesn't make your world safe. It doesn't make what you do, any of it, something I want near my son. I know that too. Then why show me? Jiho leaned back slightly. In the low light he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, a structural tiredness, the kind built into the architecture of a person over years. Because you've been running from a lie, he said. Not from me. From something I let you believe because you were gone before I could explain it, and then something moved across his face, brief and unreadable. 3 years is a long time to let a lie stand. Junkie looked at the closed folder. He didn't forgive Jiho. The word wasn't anywhere near what he felt, and he was too precise a person to reach for it prematurely. But something deep in the structure of his certainty had shifted, 1 degree, the way a compass shifts near a magnetic field, not redirected, not surrendered, just recalibrated by the presence of something he hadn't accounted for. He pushed the folder back across the desk. Good night, he said. He walked back down the hallway without waiting for a response. Behind him, the lamp stayed on. He didn't sleep. He lay on his back in the room across from Seo's with his eyes on a ceiling that was too high and too clean, listening to the building's silence, which was not true silence but the managed, engineered quiet of a place built to contain sound the way it contained everything else. No street noise. No Mrs. O's television through the wall. No distant argument from the unit above. No pipes, no city. Just the faint mechanical breath of climate control and the occasional muffled footstep from the floor below where the security rotation moved through its patient, endless circuit. He thought about the folder. About the photograph of a man he hadn't recognized. About 6 boys and a ledger written in code. At 1:40 in the morning he got up, checked on Seo, still asleep, car still in hand, undisturbed by the specific gravity of adults rearranging themselves around him, and walked to the kitchen. Made tea because it gave his hands something to do. Stood at the counter drinking it and staring at the city through the dark glass, soul reduced to light and distance, everything sharp-edged and unreachable. You should sleep. Jiho's voice came from the hallway entrance. He was still dressed, which meant he hadn't slept either, and he was carrying nothing, no file, no phone, no weapon visible, just standing at the edge of the kitchen the way he stood at the edge of most things, like a man who had learned to occupy space without requiring it to accommodate him. Junkie looked at him over the rim of his cup. I want to talk. Now. You said tonight was better than tomorrow. He set the cup down. I have conditions. Jiho crossed to the other side of the kitchen island and stood there. The overhead light was off, only the undercabinet strip lighting, low and functional, which meant they were talking in near dark like something clandestine, which was not lost on either of them and was acknowledged by neither. Say them, Jiho said. School. Junkie kept his voice flat, organized, stripped of everything except the content. A real one. Normal admissions, normal students, normal parents at the gate. Not a private arrangement with security embedded in the faculty. Seo needs to learn how to exist among ordinary people, not among people whose ordinariness is a performance. Jiho said nothing. Which meant he was listening, so Junkie continued. His name. He's been Lim Seo for 3 years. I'm not stripping that from him to put your name on him like a flag. He watched Jiho's jaw tighten, the first visible reaction. He can know who you are. He can know you're his father. But his name is his own and it doesn't get used as a declaration of territory. That's two, Jiho said. Friends. Children whose parents are not in your network, not on your payroll, not aware of who you are. At least some fraction of his social life needs to be clean of this world. A pause. You can have the bodyguard. 1. Not uniformed, not visible. I'll accept that because I'm not an idiot and this city is not safe. But 1, and he stays back. Jiho was quiet for a moment. 3 things. I have 5. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but its structural cousin, the place where amusement would have been in a man who allowed himself that. Of course you do. Medical decisions are mine, Junkie said. His and mine both. You don't override doctors I choose, you don't bring in your own physicians without my consent, you don't make health decisions for either of us because you think your resources outrank my judgment. Agreed, Jiho said. Immediately, without qualification. Junkie had prepared an argument for this one. He absorbed the immediate agreement and moved on without showing what it cost him to revise his expectations in real time. The 5th, he stopped. Chose the words carefully because this one mattered most and he refused to let it come out badly. Seo doesn't know what you do. Not in specifics. Not until he's old enough to choose whether he wants to know. You don't bring it into his eye line and you don't let your people speak carelessly around him. Jiho was quiet for longer this time. He looked at the counter between them. At the cup of tea. Back at Junkie. The school, he said finally. Normal admissions, I can manage. But the security concern is real. If my enemies learn he's enrolled somewhere without adequate protection, a school is a vulnerability, not a normalcy. I need to assess the location. Assess it. Don't control it. There's a difference. There is if you're trying to make one. A pause. Fine. The name? Jiho's jaw moved. He keeps Lim. But I want him to know Kim. As part of himself, not a secret. Not weaponized. Just known. Junkie considered this. It was more than he'd expected Jiho to concede and less than capitulation, which meant it was probably honest. I'll discuss it with him when he's old enough to have the discussion. Agreed. They looked at each other across the kitchen island at 2 in the morning, the city burning silently behind the glass, and for a moment, brief, almost startling, it felt like something Junkie had no adequate word for. Not reconciliation. Not peace. Something more provisional and more honest than either. 2 people who had stopped performing for each other long enough to simply negotiate, and had found that underneath the wreckage there was still something functional. Something that could sit across a counter in the dark and speak plainly. He didn't trust it. Trusting it would have been reckless. But he noted it. Filed it alongside the folder, alongside the recalibration, alongside everything this building was quietly doing to the architecture of his certainty. The other conditions stand, Junkie said. They stand, Jiho confirmed. Junkie picked up his cup. Then we're done for tonight. He walked back toward the hallway. Behind him, Jiho didn't move from the counter. Didn't call after him. Didn't perform the last word. Junkie got back to his room, lay down in the dark, and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in 3 years, he slept before dawn. He would think about that later. What it meant that the building that held him captive was the first place he had slept without keeping one ear open since the night he ran. He would think about it later. 3 days passed. They had the shape of normalcy without the substance of it. Seo waking early, breakfast at the kitchen table, Myung-sai learning that he would not eat eggs prepared any way except scrambled and accepting this information with the equanimity of a professional. Seo had discovered that the penthouse had a second hallway he hadn't explored and spent the better part of day 2 mapping it with the wooden car, running it along the baseboard with sound effects he provided himself, entirely at home in a place that was not home because he was 3 years old and home was wherever Junkie was. Junkie spent those 3 days learning the building the way he'd learned every place he'd lived in the last 3 years, methodically, without appearing to. He counted steps. He noted shift changes in the security rotation. He found that the service elevator required a different key card from the residential one, and that Myung-sai kept hairs in the left pocket of her apron, and that the service corridor on the floor below connected to a stairwell that descended all the way to a basement loading bay. He noted all of this and did nothing with it because Seo had pressed his palms to the window again on the second morning and laughed at Seoul like it was a gift, and the wooden car's wheels were getting a thorough workout, and for the first time in 3 years Junkie was watching his son simply exist. Not exist quietly, not exist invisibly, not exist in the careful contained way of a child who had absorbed his parents' vigilance without being told to. Just exist, loudly, freely, taking up his rightful amount of space. He hated how much that cost him. What it suggested about the price of what he'd built. On the evening of the third day he was in the kitchen helping Seo with the banana milk carton stubborn straw when he heard it. The front door opening without a knock, footsteps he recognized as Do-yoon's from the weight and pace of them, and then the specific quality of silence that followed when Do-yoon reached the office hallway and stopped. Not the silence of a man delivering routine information. The silence of a man organizing bad news into the least damaging sequence. Junkie looked at Seo. Finish your milk. You finish, Seo said generously. That's yours. Drink it. He moved to the hallway. The office door was open 4 inches. Not enough to enter without announcing himself, but enough to hear clearly, which he understood was not an accident. Jiho's building, Jiho's door, Jiho's choice whether to close it fully. He stopped in the hallway and listened without pretending otherwise. Do-yoon's voice, low and flat, 72 hours. They've known for 72 hours, minimum. The boy's existence, his approximate age, the Incheon address, which means the leak predates the retrieval. A silence. Someone told them before you went to get them, Do-yoon continued. Someone who knew what Junkie was carrying before the photograph confirmed it. The circle on that information was 6 people. 5, Jiho said. You're not counting yourself. 6 including me. I'm counting myself. A pause. I need you to count me too, or this conversation is worthless. Another silence, longer. What else do they have? They know his unclaimed. Do-yoon's voice shifted, not softer, but more deliberate, the way you speak around a thing with edges. They know he's been running suppressants. They have a medical record, I don't know how, pharmacy breach or a contact at the dispatch office, we're still tracing, that confirms his Omega status and the suppression history. A beat. Some Illinois people understand what that means operationally. Say it plainly. An unclaimed Omega with your bloodline and no bond protection is the cleanest leverage that's ever existed in this city, Jiho. They don't need to threaten you directly. They take Junkie, they take the boy, and you spend the rest of your operational life making concessions to get them back. Your syndicate fractures because your judgment is compromised. Your lieutenants start looking for stable ground. Everything you've built, Do-yoon stopped. They're not coming to kill you. They're coming to own you. Junkie stood in the hallway and felt the information settle into him the way cold water settles, finding every crack, every hollow, filling them with a precision that warmth never managed. He was leverage. He had known this in the abstract. Jiho had said it in the car, an unclaimed Omega carrying my son is, but abstract had just become architectural. Someone had sold that information. Someone in a circle of 6 had decided that Junkie's existence was a transaction and had completed it 72 hours ago, and for 72 hours Park Sung Illinois people had been moving their pieces across the board while Junkie helped his son with a banana milk straw and noted service elevator key cards like the exit still meant something. He pushed the door open. Both men looked at him. Do-yoon's expression moved through several things quickly before settling on something careful. Jiho's expression did not change at all. That was the thing. That was the specific thing that reached into Junkie's chest and rearranged something there without asking permission. Not the information, not the 72 hours, not the leverage assessment. Jiho's face. The absolute, unperformed stillness of it. Not the stillness of a man who didn't care. The stillness of a man who had already, in the seconds between receiving the information and Junkie walking through the door, moved past reaction into calculation. He had heard it and he had not flinched and he was already 3 moves ahead. Junkie had spent 3 years building a monster from that quality. Standing in this room, watching it operate in the service of something that included him and his son, he felt the monster shift in his memory, not disappear, not redeem itself, but change shape again the way it had changed shape in the lamplight over an open file folder. Something that had been simple, and was no longer. How long? Junkie said. Jiho looked at him steadily. Before they move. Before they're here. Do-yoon glanced at Jiho. A permission check. Jiho gave nothing visible, but something must have passed between them because Do-yoon said, "Our best estimate is 48 hours. Could be less if they've already positioned." Junkie stood with that for a moment. "Seo finishes his milk in about 4 minutes, he said. "After that he'll want someone to run the car with him in the hallway. I need you," he looked at Jiho, "to not be in a closed room having this conversation where the next thing I hear is that a decision has been made about my son and myself without my presence." He stepped fully into the office. "So, what happens now? Tell me everything. And do not," he said, with a precision that left no room for interpretation, "manage what you tell me based on what you think I can handle." Jiho studied him for a long, measured moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from his desk. "Sit down," he said. "Not an order. The same tone as the hallway 3 days ago. Stay behind me before it was spoken, before the moment that would require it." The tone of a man who was asking, in the only register he knew how to use. Junkie Saturday. Outside the window, Seoul burned bright and indifferent 60 floors below. Somewhere in its grid, 48 hours away or perhaps less, Park Sung, Illinois people were already moving. The door to the office stayed open. The alarms came at 3:14 in the morning. Not a gradual thing, not a warning tone building to a klaxon. One moment the penthouse was silent, Seoul burning its patient indifferent burned 60 floors below, and the next every light in the building shifted to emergency red and the alarm split the air like something physical, like a pressure change, like the building itself inhaling sharply before a scream. Junkie was moving before he was fully awake. 3 years of sleeping with one ear open didn't switch off just because he'd slept soundly for 3 nights. His body had its own protocol, feet on the floor, door open, hallway in 4 steps, and he ran it without thought, crossed the hall, had Seo in his arms before the boy had fully transitioned from startled crying to the louder, more coherent panic that was building in his chest. Junkie pressed Seo's face into his shoulder and put his back against the wall beside the door, away from the window, the way he'd mentally rehearsed on the first night without acknowledging to himself that he was rehearsing. "Sha. I have you. I have you." Seo's fingers found the back of Junkie's neck and held on. Jiho was already in the hallway. He had come from the direction of the office, not his bedroom, which meant he hadn't slept, had been awake and working and was therefore dressed, and the gun at his side was holstered but his hand was on it and he was moving with that quality Junkie had no word for except inevitable, like a current, like something that had decided its direction and would not be diverted. Do-yoon was 2 steps behind him, phone to his ear, face tight with the controlled urgency of a man receiving very bad information at significant speed. Jiho reached the hallway junction and stopped. He turned and looked at Junkie with Seo pressed against his shoulder, back against the wall, jaw set, eyes clear because Junkie Lim did not have the option of falling apart and never had, and the expression on Jiho's face was the thing that Junkie would carry with him long after this night resolved itself one way or another. Not strategy. Not calculation. Not the managed stillness that had terrified him in the office 3 days ago. Something that had no performance in it whatsoever. Something that looked, stripped of everything Jiho used to keep himself unreadable, like the specific fear of a man confronting the possibility of losing something he hadn't understood he needed until this exact moment. "Stay behind me," Jiho said. Not an order. The words had the shape of one but none of the architecture. No command in them, no expectation of compliance, nothing that assumed the outcome. Almost a plea. The voice of a man asking rather than directing, which was perhaps the only truly unprecedented thing Kim Jiho had ever done in Junkie's presence. Junkie looked at him for 1 second. 1 full second of assessment, of every accumulated piece of information. The folder, the kitchen at 2 in the morning, the prepared room, the open office door, 72 hours and a circle of 6 and a man who had not flinched when the world announced it was coming for what was his. "Don't get shot," Junkie said. Something moved across Jiho's face. He turned back toward the elevator bank. Do-yoon lowered his phone. Lower levels are breached. They came up through the service corridor. He looked briefly at Junkie, an acknowledgement Junkie received without expression. Basement loading bay. They took out the security rotation on floors 58 and 59. "We have 4 men between them and this floor." "The stairwell," Jiho said. "Covered. But they're not using the stairwell." Do-yoon's jaw tightened. "They brought enough to come up the shaft." The elevator bank was at the end of the hallway. 30 meters. The numbers above the doors were dark. Power to the residential elevators had been cut, which meant building security had triggered a lockdown, which meant the 4 men between Park Sung Illinois people and this floor were fighting a managed retreat in a building that was systematically being taken apart from the bottom. Seo had stopped crying. He was very still in Junkie's arms, the way he went still when he understood that something was serious even if he didn't understand what. That quality he'd inherited from his father, the ability to go quiet and watchful when the room changed. His hand was still at Junkie's neck. He was listening. "There's a secondary exit," Jiho said to Do-yoon. "North service panel, 58th floor ceiling access. Already sent 2 men. Then we wait for..." The elevator bank detonated. Not both of them. The right side door blew outward into the hallway in a single catastrophic compression of sound and pressure and debris, and the hallway filled instantly with smoke and the smell of scorched metal and something chemical that Junkie's body identified as dangerous before his mind caught up. He turned into the wall, curved himself around Seo, felt the pressure wave move across his back like a flat hand shoving. Then silence. The specific, ringing silence that exists on the other side of an explosion like a negative space, the world suddenly too quiet where a moment ago it was too loud. Jiho was still standing. Do-yoon was pulling him back from the smoke line, one hand on his arm, saying something into his phone with a velocity that meant the situation was moving faster than the plan had accounted for. Junkie straightened. Looked at the blown elevator door hanging from one hinge in a hallway filling with gray smoke. Looked at Seo's face against his shoulder, eyes open, watching, afraid but present, his father's eyes in his father's building in his father's war. And understood, with the same cold clarifying precision that had carried him through 3 years of survival, exactly what he was standing inside. He had spent 3 years believing he was hiding from Kim Jiho's world. Had believed that the danger was Jiho, that proximity to this man was the source of the threat, and distance was the cure, and if he ran far enough and stayed invisible long enough the war would never find them. He had been wrong about the geometry of it entirely. The war had not found them here. They were the reason it started. An unclaimed Omega carrying Jiho's bloodline, unprotected and exposed, not a casualty of this conflict but its ignition point. Park Sung Illinois had not come because Jiho was powerful. He had come because Junkie existed, and was vulnerable, and was the one crack in an otherwise impenetrable man. 3 years of running had not moved them away from the target. It had made them one. Junkie. Jiho's voice, cutting through the ringing. He was at Junkie's side. When had he crossed the hallway? How had he moved that fast? One hand not quite touching his arm, hovering, asking. "There's a room behind the north panel. Reinforced. It's for this. Take Seo and go with Do-yoon." Junkie looked at him. At the smoke. At the ruined elevator door. "And you?" he said. Jiho's jaw moved. "I'll follow." "That's not what I asked." Something in Jiho's expression shifted, fractured, almost, the way ice fractures before it gives, something underneath briefly visible. Then he said, very quietly, "I'll follow. I promise you." Junkie had not trusted a promise in 3 years. He held Seo tighter and looked at Kim Jiho, this man he'd run from, this man who had retrieved him, this man whose face lived in his son's bones, and made a decision not because he trusted the promise but because he trusted, against every reasonable instinct he possessed, the man making it. "Seo," he said quietly, into his son's hair. "Hold on tight." Seo's arms tightened around his neck. Junkie moved. Behind him, he heard Jiho turn back toward the smoke. The war had just begun.